some of these 14 items. Laurie, you want to take it up, please?
Yeah, just to say a couple of things about the Pirkei Avot around it. There are all the lists that they're talking about. One is the 10 sayings, which the world was created, 10 generations from Adam to Noah, another 10 from Noah to Abraham, 10 trials by which Abraham was tested, 10 miracles in Egypt, another 10 at the Red Sea, and yet a third set of 10 miracles in the temple, and then 10 things that were created at twilight. And that's the list that we just talked about now. And following the 10s comes the 7s and then the 4s. There's a whole bunch of proverbs that go after that that are like 2s and 2s. They go together. This is the last of the 10 things. And so it's very interesting from a perspective of lists and why lists matter. From a sort of broader comparative religion perspective, there are many early religious traditions, not just Judaism, but Hinduism, Buddhism, and so on, that see lists in themselves as sacred, not just genealogies, which itself is a form of a list, right? But also lists as a way of counting everything that there could be, a way of counting totality or the entirety of the universe. So I think that that's part of why there's a list at creation. And I think it's a really interesting sort of part of the Pirkei Avot is to have this group of lists to try and get everything in there as much as you possibly can. And so what we wanted to do now is to open it up and just ask people what you think the commonality is. Let's not do the demons, the grave of Moses, and the ram of Abraham, or the tongs yet, but let's just look at the 10, the first 10, and share what you all think is the commonality between all these lists of 10. And just jump in, I can only see, ask to unmute. Yeah, there, that's David. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, first of all, the first 10 are all from the Chumash. They're all from the books of Moses. So they all deal with that, which is an interesting sort of set of limitation. The next set go beyond that, but the first 10 are all about that.
Yeah, that's true. Anybody else?
Although I would ask David.
Oh, Janet, hang on.
I'm sorry. Does Janet have something to say? Yeah. Go ahead.
Janet, I'm just unmuting you. I think I'm unmuting you. Somehow I can't unmute you, Janet. Sorry. If you could write in the chat, and Phyllis, for some reason I'm not able to. Oh, here we go. Does that work?
They should be able to unmute themselves, actually.
Oh, okay. People could try to unmute themselves.
Yeah, I can unmute myself.
Okay, there. Whoops. Yeah, I think, Phyllis, you're unmuted now.
Right. Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
I didn't have anything to say. I just joined in. I'm in Los Angeles.
Okay.
I crawled out of bed. I'm sitting here in my robe about 2 seconds in. So
okay.
give me a moment to sort of assimilate and figure out where, wake up. So,
sure. Okay. Was there somebody else who had asked to unmute? I'm just looking. There's Diane. Okay.
Laurie, how come I can't see these people here?
Hang on just a second. I'm trying to do the ask to unmute, and somehow that isn't happening.
Should we find unmute?
Diane, are you on? Somehow I was able to do it with David, but not with Diane. There you go. Oh, no, that doesn't work.
Diane, are you able to unmute yourself?
There we go.
People can
Okay,
unmute themselves.
Yeah, I think people can now unmute themselves. Go ahead, Diane.
Oh, I didn't have a question or anything or comment. I'm okay.
Oh, okay. All right. I'm looking at all the people who are unmuted. Okay. So Shalom, do you want to add more about what you think about these 10?
Oh, no, I wanted to respond to David's comment about, yes, they're all from the Chumash, but what about the Shamir, David? What would you say about that? Like, is that really from the Chumash?
Oh, David, you're muted.
The commandment not to use the iron on the altar of the temple is in Exodus.
Yes.
But the solution to the problem, of course, is not there.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
But the problem is set up by that weird commandment, which comes at the very end of the whole 10 Commandments story about when you get a place to set up the temple and you make this altar, you shouldn't use iron, which is very, Laurie, is very interesting. There's actually a whole thread of anti-metal in the Chumash, in
Yes.
the Mosaic books. And the issue about sort of technology, generally speaking, and the Mosaic books is really fascinating. Really fascinating.
Yes, and we're gonna get to that soon. I'm glad you brought that up.
This is so important, and I hope we get there because there's a whole discussion of metallurgy that we want to have. Sheva, hi. It's so nice to see you. All right, I think, can you unmute yourself?
I'm capable of doing that.
Hi.
Hi.
Hey, Sandy.
Hi, Laurie.
So first of all, I came in like 2 minutes late. What exactly is this document? And second, maybe this is a trick question. Maybe there's nothing. I'm trying to find out what's in common with these. So the first three seem to like the mouth of this, and so we get it. And they all are things that act, well, the mana doesn't, well, I don't know. I guess I was going to say the mana doesn't exist, but maybe in the minds of the writers, it does exist. So I'm really having trouble putting them all together.
Figuring them out.
Yeah.
Okay, but Sheva, first we should say this is Pirkei Avot.
This is actually Pirkei Avot. Okay.
Yeah. Pirkei Avot and
Chapter 5.
Chapter 5.
Okay. Okay.
And so this is great because the thing I love about lists is that they're like puzzles, especially if they're from ancient times or other cultures or wherever, even if their own tradition. So the commentaries that we've read, both contemporary and ancient, suggest that all of these things are miraculous, things that would be outside the natural order of things. So the mouth of the earth that swallowed Korach, right? That's a miraculous move. The mouth
Okay.
followed them everywhere is miraculous. The mouth of the donkey that speaks is outside the natural order. It's a miracle. The rainbow that appeared, that would be interesting. You know, that clearly the text could see it as miraculous, even if it's a natural phenomenon. The manna, as Sheva just said, the staff of Moses is magical at a certain level, right? And that
Yes, so well, you recall it turns into a snake and then it can be turned back into.
So these are referring to actually, not just are these things in the Chumash, but they are referring to specific events.
Yes.
Like, okay, got it. So
Yeah,
this
things
is
about
like
an event.
Bilam's donkey that spoke or something.
Yeah.
I get it. Okay.
And Shalom, do you want to talk about, I don't know if Sheva, you were there about the Shamir worm, but the Shamir worm is miraculous in that it goes through stone, and that's how Solomon could build the temples.
Okay.
But the letters, the writing, and the tablets, you want to say more about that?
Could
Well,
I?
Oh, yeah, Mary
It's
Joan.
Mary Joan, yeah. What always struck me about this list was if you didn't have it, then you would be tempted to say a lot of things in the Chumash were bunk, you know. There's no such thing as a talking donkey. Yes, there is if God created it before the Sabbath. You know, each one of those things, the manna, for example, it's just something that you would be incredulous about it. And yet, if God created it, then you have to say, oh, okay, I understand understand, you know. So I
Yeah, that's a great point, and this is something that Maimonides comments about this Mishnah, and we'll get to that soon. Laurie, as the philosopher, will introduce that. But I want to pick up about metallurgy and what David was saying about the problem or the fascination that the Chumash has with metallurgy. And here I'm going to read, I think it's a text we have, Laurie, Genesis chapter 4.
Oh, yeah.
This is verses 17 to 22, which one could think of as kind of a founding document of how civilization emerges. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch, and he was building a city, and he called the city after the name of his son, Enoch. So here we have the establishment of city-state, what we now call the city-states of the ancient world. And Irad was born to Enoch, and Irad begot Meheuel, and Mehuel begot Metushael, and Metushael begot Lemech. And Lemech took himself 2 wives. One was named Ada, and the other was named Tzillah. Now Ada bore Jabal. He was the father of those who dwell in tents and have cattle. So here we have the notion of how agriculture and domestic animals got established as an institution. And his brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all who grasp a lyre and flute. Again, with the emergence of city-states. And this is very vivid if you study the history of ancient Iraq. Here we have the first musician. And to our point, to our Mishnah, and Tzillah, she too bore Tubal-Cain, who sharpened all tools that cut copper and iron. So now we have the first smith, the first metallurgist. And then we can't forget these last few words in Hebrew, V'achot Tuval-Kain Ne'amah. And Tubal-Cain's sister was Naamah. This is very enigmatic. Not many women get mentioned. And then we don't learn what she did. Something I remember from my yeshiva education is the saying, and I don't know the source of it, Ve'achot Tuval-Kain Ne'amah is as important as the 10 Commandments. That is, every word of the Bible is of equal weight. So if you think it's not important that Tubal-Cain's sister was Naamah, you're rejecting the whole idea of revelation. I'm not asking you to accept this, I'm just telling you that's the rabbinic attitude. But let's stay with the iron. The iron, the music, the cities, the pastoral life, all of this is in just a few verses introduced to us. So Laurie, perhaps you want to reflect on this.
Yeah.
I know you have Indian comparands and...
Well, the interesting thing, and I want to hear what David has to say too about this, or anybody else jumping in, but the interesting thing about metal is that a number of different theorists, when people were theorizing about all the world religions, which people don't do anymore, but when they did, there was a lot of interesting comparative study of smiths. And in general, smiths were magical. And so the question is why? Why are they magical? And there are 2 answers. One is because they literally what would take 1,000 years, right, to create metal in the ground is actually speeded up in the process of metallurgy, creating metal, so that it's like a magical compression of time is the way that some ancient societies outside of Israel spoke about smiths. This was true in India. This was true in South America, certainly not, we don't know how long ago, but it was true in Aztec and Mayan cultures. So that's one possible reason, but always they're understood as magical. The other is that their use of tools like tongs. Many ancient cultures had hymns to honor tools or to worship tools in some way or other, because they were understood as magical extensions of the person. You know, when you had a spear, and you learned how to use a spear, it was understood as a magical extension of your arm. And so they had either magical power or sacred power. And so the tongs here, even if they're not understood in that same way, they still have that element. And that, you know, because you, and I think Mary Jones' point was really great, that you can't, none of this could actually exist as anything but made by God, and therefore it is part of God's creation, and it has to be named early so that it sort of, and I want to get to that a little bit later about how we think about creation and what creation is. David, did you want to say something more about the anti-metal thing? Because it would make a lot of sense that given the magicality of metal and smithies, that this would be understood as, you know, something to be suspicious of.
Yeah, I think there's a great deal, obviously there's a great deal of power, particularly iron, I think. I mean, the copper, we have those copper snakes in numbers and so forth. But the word for iron, barzel, I have checked on this, and that's not a Semitic word. I think the origin of it is unclear, but it's a borrowed word. Probably the technology for doing iron came from elsewhere into this world, and so it changed the world. I mean, it changed everything. If you had iron and were capable of doing that, then it was not so different from nuclear weaponry. I mean, it was very, very powerful.
Yeah, and from God, right? It's almost like a divine power.
It's very, very, so it's a very strong thing. So, and the difference between copper and bronze and iron, you were going on about other cultures. You can find a lot of this kind of stuff in Homer as well, and more in Hesiod, about the smith and so on. So it's a great story, but it's clear that the Chumash is afraid of iron.
Right.
Afraid of iron. And probably with good reason, you know.
So interesting.
So let me pick that up and suggest that later in the Tanakh, when we read about David's wars, the wars of the Israelites with the surrounding people, an initial disadvantage is that the Israelites do not have iron, right? And this is bemoaned. So perhaps this has to do with the part of their insecurity is not having that technology. So yeah, this would be a great dissertation. I imagine there are a few already about this subject.
Mary
Jo, have a question.
Mary Jo.
Laurie, no, I was just going to say that I notice in many places in the Tanakh, whenever an altar has to be built, they specifically say, don't touch it with a tool, you know, pile it up, make it work somehow without a tool. So it's either not only that we might be afraid of it, but we're being defiant that we don't have it, and we're making it a rule, in effect, not to be embarrassed by the fact that we don't have it, you know?
It's so interesting. I mean, so the other piece of the philosophy about tools, there's a wonderful book by Daniel Rothbard, a philosopher. It's called Tools and Minds, M-I-N-D-S, how we understand cognitively our relationship to tools. And he begins with a spear and goes all the way up to the computer algorithm.
Wow.
And one of the things, beautiful book, and it's a philosophy book. It's not like a history of tool making or anything, although he uses a lot of that to philosophize. But his argument is that even though we get more and more abstract in our view of tools, right, there still is at root a kind of magicality to our understanding of it. And that we never can fully let go of that because we can't help but see tools as an extension of ourselves. And anything that is an augmentation of power is something that we need to be very, to your point, Mary Joan, and to David, very ambivalent about. It's an ambiguous power. It could be divine power. You know, in some cultures, it is divine power, and it's a manifestation of divine grace or support, or the weapons themselves are divine, right? There still is in the Serbian church, if you look at some of the history of the Yugoslavian war, when I was doing this paper on tools that I was thinking about, there is a blessing of all the weapons before, in the Yugoslav war in the 90s, before the Serbs went into battle. And you can see the priests doing a blessing over all these guns. It's, it makes you, I mean, it's kind of chilling to see, but you see it, sort of everywhere. That's a culture that sees, power and tools. Whereas I think David's right that there's this way in which, I love what you said, Mary Jo. There's both, we don't want to use it because we might be engaging in magical ways of thinking or being, and we're going to be defiant. Like, that's why the Shamir worm is so interesting, right?
This discussion makes me realize that perhaps it's evident, but it was foggy to me that there are really two things about technology here, the Shamir and the Tzfat. That is, they both address this question of tools. The Shamir answers the problem of how to cut stone. Well, yes, it's weird not to use metal, but God is going to give us a tool. And by the way, Solomon, who can speak to all the birds and animals, can give instructions to the Shamir. Because the Shamir, like the golem, you can imagine if you have this cutting worm in front of you, it could just go wild. But Solomon knows what to say to it. Cut here, cut there, and do what you're supposed to do. So that's one technology issue settled. And then the tzvat, the tongues, is the other. Right? So this midrash is more technological than I realized.
Well, we had a really interesting conversation last night about it, because part of the issue is this logical thing, right? You can never have the first tongs. It's the same like with India. The first yogurt is called dahi. And so how do you make dahi? You take a little dahi and put it with milk. And then when is the first dahi? Like, when is the first yogurt? And the first yogurt did exist, right? It existed when milk curdled in a particular way so that it became yogurt and not curdled milk. And so there was a point when something like tongs existed, but I mean, historically, accurately, there are uses of tools that are sort of combination of metal and stone and so forth. So there was probably a first like tong-like thing that then became made into tongs, but from the biblical perspective, that couldn't exist. Like, there's no way that it could actually be the case that there was ever a first tongs. So it's this, the really interesting difference between the Bible's view of history and our own understanding of the history of technology.
Now, I was hoping someone would ask me about this word Shamir. So does anyone recognize this as a name? Like, whose name was it?
The Prime Minister of Israel, Yitzhak Shamir.
Yeah, whose real name is Itzik Nitsky. That's his real name. And his name is Yitzhak Shamir. That's his underground name. It's the head of the Stern Gang fighting the British. And he took this name because he was the worm cutting through the Brits, cutting through all the enemies. Right?
So Shalom, I want to come back to the technology, but can you talk about the letters, the writing, and the tablets? Because that's just so interesting.
Well, I did say, I thought I said in the beginning, that the letters can be seen by both sides. I didn't? Okay, here we have a couple's disagreement. Okay, I will say it in a different way. Let's look at it in Hebrew. Haktav, v'hamichtav, v'haluchot. So the ktav itself, that is, the shape of the letters, is considered, the way it's incised, that's a miracle. You remember in Exodus that God incises it. Oh, it's like in Raiders of the Lost Ark. Remember when they open the Ark and all that lightning comes out? Or even better, for popular culture, in the Ten Commandments, you can see it being written miraculously. I think that's the way the rabbis were imagining. I know that that's the way, because this is in the Gemara, a discussion of this. The Ktav. Also, the discussion proceeds there's an argument about what type of ktav. The Hebrew that we see today in front of us in this text is not the ancient Hebrew. The ancient Hebrew, which you can see on some Israeli coins or on documents, is very different looking. So the Hebrew that we have in front of us today is called Ktav Ashuri, Assyrian writing. But this is understood to be in the ancient writing, and it's more angular. So from an artistic standpoint, it would be easier and more aesthetically carved into the tablets. Now, I think the ktav is the writing itself, the michtav is the manner in which it's incised, and the luchot have their own power. I can offer these explanations. I'm open to other ones. So I want to say about the luchot, when I was reading about this, of all these things, the only thing that seems to me to be left to history, or would have been left for a while, are the luchot. They don't have the worm, right? We sure don't have the donkey. So in the first temple, these miraculous tablets were there, and then they were lost or stolen. They were lost to history. So I'll add that again, something that occurs to me now. Perhaps the luchot are the last vestige of this miraculous list, something that God created on the last minute of creation, and it's still there in the temple until the temple is destroyed by the Babylonians. When the temple is restored by the Persians, 5 things are missing. And one of them are the tablets of the law.
Yeah. So, just go ahead.
Yeah, I think we should proceed to the next 3. These weird.
Oh yeah, the weird things.
The demons. I mean, they're no weird. Are they weirder? Are they different? Anyone
they're
have a
not.
suggestion like why separate these? Oh well, David suggested the things to do with the Chumash, right?
Right. Although the demons, the grave of Moses and the ram of Abraham, aren't they also part of the Chumash? I mean,
well, yeah, but not the demons.
Not the demons, the grave of Moses and the ram of Abraham. Yeah, it's interesting they sort of added those. Any thoughts about those on the list, those 3?
Anyone surprised by demons or mizikin? Anyone want to? Shava, you want to say something about that, or?
I mean, we were just saying what demons? What does this refer to?
Right.
But without the demons, you don't have an explanation for when bad things happen. So you need them. You need them so you have a place to put all your anger and terror and so on.
Yeah, interesting idea.
It is. I mean, yes, there are no mizikin in the Bible, but they're very powerful force in rabbinic literature.
Diane, you were going to jump in?
So I guess my question is, some of these have a one-time purpose, like an angel has a one-time purpose. And so the manna had a one-time purpose. The staff had the one-time purpose. The ram, the tongs that made the tongs. These are sort of one-time purposes. And some of these are supposed to be a little bit longer, but in some sense, as Shalom was saying, the tablets didn't survive, and so and that's really, that looks like really the demons. And I mean, I don't know, are the demons still around? So I guess that was going to be my question: is a lot of these things, sort of going off what Shalom was saying, a lot of these they don't exist anymore. But some of them really were a purpose of a one-shot deal.
That's, Diane, that's exactly what one of our contemporary commentators talked about, which is that the first 10 have the same thing as the angel. They're there They create a change in the story, in the Chumash, etc. But the other three, the Ram of Abraham, it could be argued, could belong in the first list, but the other three are not necessarily there for one-time purpose. They're more, because, you know, the burning bush could have been the Ram of Abraham not the burning bush, but the Ram of Abraham appearing, you know, right before the sacrifice of Isaac. That's not a purpose that changes the story in quite the same way. He could have just said, okay, I'm not going to sacrifice my son, right? Because God intervenes, right? So all three of them are mysterious, but they don't have a purpose. So that's exactly what most of the contemporary commentators say, is that difference.
The grave and the ram.
Yeah. Sorry, was someone going to say something? It sounded like there was a voice.
So Misikin, I mean, well, we have a great Yiddishist here. We always say, as a mazik, right? A person, you know, we say that about, usually endearingly about a kid, at least as far as I know. But the Talmud is full of these beings who are, yes, as Mary Jo said, they cause us a lot of trouble, and they can explain some of the pitfalls of life.
So I.B. Singer is full of them too.
Oh, yes,
Yeah,
that's right.
So, I mean, they certainly lived on in Eastern Europe. I mean,
Yes.
the mazik, you know, it's like saying, oh, he's a little devil, right?
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
But here we're really speaking about more like real devils, right? Not little devils.
Right. But I'm saying the idea of the real devils was certainly in Eastern European
Yes.
culture.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't say.
David wanted
Oh,
to.
I'm sorry, David, go ahead.
Shalom or Laurie, just a question. Do you know, I have the suspicion that the origin of these mazikin inter-rabbinic literature is from Iran, is from Persian culture, and their fascination with the gods, because there's a kind of, you know, treatment of the demons and gods in
Yep.
Persian culture.
Right. So in the Avesta, which is the document that predates the Vedas in India, and or at least some say it does, and then, you know, moves into the Middle Eastern engagement. There is the asura, which is what the term is, that comes into the Sanskrit, is they're equal. No world that is created that's a self-respecting world, any good world has both asura and deva, has demons, and so my guess would be that there's sort of like what you see in Mesopotamian culture too, that there's this cosmic battle between good and evil, but that's how the world is created. So I think that if it does, I wouldn't be able to answer you etymologically, David, but if it does move from the Iranian culture, it's from this idea of a cosmic battle being fought out, because it's very, very strong. And what happens in India is that an asura is just, you can't have a deva without an asura. So it's not like devas always have to win. It's that devas and asuras always have to struggle in order for there to be creativity. It's a very different idea of what a creative principle is, the way I would put it.
And from what I understand, there's a kind of opposite valence of deva in Avesta and deva in Vedas and so forth.
Yes, sometimes asuras are good in the Avesta, and
Yeah.
sometimes devas are evil. Yeah, that's exactly right.
David, I think it's an interesting theory, but this was once, you know, the Iran influence, I think, can be overplayed. Not in this specific, but in general. I mean, when I was in graduate school, it was very powerful, this idea that these are Iranian influences. But now I think we tend to think of them as ancient Near Eastern, like Mesopotamian, that later gets into Iran also.
Yeah, I was thinking, I mean, maybe being too much of a linguist, I was thinking of the difference between Semitic and Indo-European background, not so much chronologically as from different sources. And that was sort of, but I'm not, you know, I really am not up on this at all. So
It would have had to have come through the Hittite if it came that way, in terms of Indo-European influence on Semitic languages.
okay.
So I suggest, because we have a few more things to do,
Yeah.
that Laurie, you help us with what the Rambam, with what Maimonides has to say about
Okay, yeah, so
this question.
so the really interesting thing that happens next is what Rambam argues. We don't have it in the text, but we thought we'd just read it to you, which is, they say, and this is really interesting to me, it's in the Guide to the Perplexed, 229. It says, for they said that when God created the present reality and coded within it in the nature familiar to us, he established within this nature order that all miracles that have since taken place would take place. And that, I think, is very much Mary Jones' point earlier, right? I'll read it again. For they said that when God created the present reality and encoded within it the nature familiar to us, he established within this nature order that all miracles that have since taken place would take place. And several of the contemporary commentators talk about this as reflecting the idea that time can be divided into two epochs, right? The time of creation and the time of post-creation, right? This made us laugh, just as this is us commentating, because we were talking about this in the last couple of days. We were thinking, you know, God's kind of like, okay, wait, I know I'm on deadline, but wait, I've got to do just 10 more things, you know, just let me do those 10 things, right? You can see a sort of Mel Brooks kind of, you know, funny humorousness around it. But on the week of creation, once the week of creation ended, the world was sat and unchangeable, right? This is the idea, Kohler looking at Maimonides here. The reality that existed when Sabbath began would have to persist for eternity. So if there was anything that would later need to be changed, God would need to be created before the Sabbath. At twilight, we find God rapidly creating 10 things that would need to be in place for later history, which again, I loved as an idea of God rushing against the deadline, right, to make sure all those miraculous things were in place. But I thought that was really interesting philosophically, right? And this led to 2 or 3 commentaries on contemporary commentaries on this passage, which deal with computers and technology, back to David's earlier point, right? That it's sort of like set as a clock, and God is watching that play out, and he has to have all the miracles in place so that the clock can play out, which it's not exactly mechanistic, but it's pretty close. And then the question is, there was a very interesting commentary on that tongs are easy for people to use and computers to use. And there's a sort of question of the computer algorithm that some of these things might have been or been similar to, if you see this view of creation.
Laurie, I want to add one thing to this view of creation. What it does in terms of the background to Maimonides, the history of Jewish thought and of Greek and Arab thought, what it asserts is that miracles are not what we think they are. They're not changes in the world, but they're part of the world. That is, what we perceive as a miracle is really part of the natural order.
Or the created order.
Of the created order, right, because it was there from the beginning.
Yeah.
Everything is perfect from the beginning.
And then, so what's interesting about this is then it creates a whole other idea. I want to open it up to what people think about this, but I want to introduce the idea, which we're going to come back to in the last 10 minutes of the class, about rest, right? So does God actually rest on the Sabbath in the creation, or on that 7th day? Or, as many contemporary commentators say, responding to the Rambam, is actually God just sits back and watches. God stops, which is very different than resting, right? And a couple of commentators in the 21st century say, it's not that God got tired, it's that God had to watch it actually start unfolding the way he had planned it, the way Shalom was just talking Maybe we should pause there and just get reaction to or responses to that idea or the Rambam's idea as well as others. Any thoughts about that?
Could we go back to going back to your idea about lists?
Yes.
In regard to the seventh day and the resting, the line in Psalms about teach us to count our days,
Yeah.
which is often taken as a sort of memento mori, think about death and so forth and so on, could also be taken as, well, let's see, who counted days? Oh, I think I know. They did that in Genesis, didn't they? So that's a sort of godly thing to do, to count the days.
Yeah.
And the 7 is a counting. It's a completion of the counting. And it's not an accident that the Mishkan in Leviticus is on the 8th day. It's on the day after, right? So there's a the counting idea plays exactly into the Shabbat.
And David,
completion of counting.
Yeah, and your idea is beautifully reflected in Bamidbar when they take the census, right? That the counting is understood as a sacred act of, and it's literally, I don't remember the Hebrew, but it's the lifting up of the head, right? When you count all the people, and that census is a very holy thing because it represents that totality. So that's a beautiful connection.
Yes, but it's holy, but it's also dangerous, because let's remember that the census can lead to a plague. And that happens a number of times in the Tanakh.
Not to be too contemporary about census and plagues happening
And
at the
is
same
everyone
time.
familiar with the
Just one point, if you ever get a chance, Hermann Broch, the Austrian novelist and writer, mid 20th century, has a book called The Guilt List, which on the whole isn't great, but it has an introduction, which is a rabbinic story. I absolutely recommend it. It is all about counting and time and Shabbos. It is beautiful. The rest of the book you can take or leave, but the Guilt List is the book. Broch, B-R-O-C-H.
So
but I do want to mention about the danger of counting. So how do you know if you have a minion?
Right.
You're not allowed to count the people in the room because you could kill them by counting them.
Yeah.
So you have to find a verse in the Tanakh that has 10 words in it. There are many, and then you use that, right? The famous one is Hoshea et Amecha, right? So the ancients were afraid of counting, and I guess God is the great counter and sets the great count in motion.
So this is such an interesting
We have
idea.
10 minutes.
We have 10 minutes, right, Any other thoughts about this? We wanted to end with a disagreement with the Rambam and this whole idea, just to keep it lively. So if there aren't any, or you're still contemplating, one of the other things that I think this idea of creating something that is complete and to be set in motion also has a different understanding, therefore, of our observance of Shabbat, right? Which is that it's not that you're resting, it's that you are participating in intimations of completion and intimations of perfection, which is really different. There's just little hints of it everywhere on Shabbat, because what this is about is seeing the totality, seeing the perfection, having a little bit of a glimpse on earth of what that would look like. And the Garden of Eden, before the turning away of that perfection, from that perfection. So I thought that was really interesting. And so it gets into a philosophical discussion and also a practical one, right? Of what do you do on Shabbat, right? What are you doing? And for me, it's mostly about exhaustion and, recovering and so on. But I hadn't thought of it as being reminded of the totality as being the first thing, of having intimations of perfection as being the first thing, rather than resting. Because most people think of Shabbat as sort of a place for holy rest, which is a lovely idea. So any thoughts about that in terms of how either you observe Shabbat? Diane?
Yeah, I have a question about perfection. Why where does the perfection come from? Only because it's God, and so whatever God does is perfect? We have to assume that?
Yes, go ahead.
Because it seems like, maybe in the sort of teachings of Rabbi Sager, it's sort of, you get an impression of, in Genesis especially, there's the baby God, and the God is sort of growing up and learning
Right.
things. And so, in some sense, maybe it's not necessarily that the world was created perfectly. I mean, he had to destroy it a couple times, right? And so, is there, I guess the perfection part, I understand the completion part, but it's the perfection part, I guess, I'm interested in pushing back on. I know we don't have much time, but.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I would like to speak to that. I think the idea of perfection, I don't think it's, well, the Bible asserts kitov, again and again, after the creation. So the creation of the world makes perfection, but the creation of humans is where the problem comes in. So humans can never be perfect, but the rabbinic idea is that the world is perfect. Humans are always messing it up and have to be put in some kind of system where they don't mess it up. And we can find many analogies to the modern world.
David was going to jump in.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just two things. One, the word perfect and the word complete are pretty much the same. We think of perfect as something more than just finished, but perfect really means it's finished. The other thing is that Rambam in Hilchot Shabbos begins his discussion of Shabbos by saying that the mitzvah of Shabbos is a positive mitzvah, a mitzvah oseh, something you do, not something you don't do.
Nice, very nice.
Yes.
He has a negative mitzvah and a positive mitzvah. And he says, this is a mitzvah oseh. That's the very beginning. His first thing he says about Shabbos is that it's a mitzvah oseh. It's a confrontation. It's a slap in the face. So
that's great.
Shalom.
Yeah.
Shalom. I hesitate to bring this up because he knows this stuff much better. But
No, it's great. It's really helpful. But Diane, I think there's an ambiguity there that it definitely is in the English, and you're right to raise it. Something I've struggled with. So, and it's sort of related to the last thing I was going to leave you with, which is a poem, because I kept seeing in the contemporary commentary on this passage about, the things that got created beforehand that then needed to be part of the completion of creation. This idea of Shabbat, and that, we see in the completion of creation Shabbat, and in the completion, and in Shabbat, the completion of creation, that understanding. And everyone kept saying, it's not that God rested. It's not that God rested. And I'm like, what occurred to me a long time ago in this poem is, what if rest were part of the completion, right? What if rest were part of the world? So this is a poem that is about that. It's not from anything from Genesis, but it's related to this larger question. So it's from Re'eh, Parsha Re'eh, and it's a Deuteronomic, the 15:1, at the end of every 7 years you shall make a release. So I'll just read you the poem, and we can talk about it for a couple minutes before we all have to go, sadly. There is a sad fatigue to the number 7. It's the winding down of our long march, the end of our delight in the stability of 3 and the roundness of 4. It even lacks the nest-like qualities of 6, where 2 3s are intertwined. We tire when we think of Ezekiel's 7 angels raging over the earth without ceasing. Our eyes close when we are told of the walls of Jericho falling on the 7th day, their stones too weak to withstand the holy winds. Our heads fall as we learn of the Romans finishing their city on that 7th hill, exhausted. We say on the 7th day God rested, but perhaps we should say on the 7th day God got tired. Perhaps 7 gives us permission to let the wind take us away from all our fields, all our cities, and all the old anxious works of our hands.
Thank you, Laurie. That's still a great poem.
Any thoughts or idea about that?
Isn't there some meditation in Nietzsche about God being an insomniac?
I don't know, but it's wonderful. I'll look it
Yeah,
up.
the idea that God is always watching, it's sort of like insomnia, and that's crazy, and so on. Yeah, I think there's somewhere there.
Yeah, and I think what the contemporary commentators miss around, it's not that God rested, it's that God made it complete, is that rest is part of the completion,
Yeah.
it seems to me, that I've always understood. Mary Joan?
No, I like that idea. Gives us permission to do what we need to do.
Right.
And the perfection is still out there. I mean, as long as we're here, we're never going to achieve that, but we can still aim for it. We can still picture it in our heads.
Yeah, I like that. Shiva? Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, question. It's a lovely poem. Given that my name is Sheva, I wish you had me. So when we say Shavat vayinafash, how do we translate that verb generally? I've always thought of it, and he rested, but is that not really the translation, or what are the other possibilities for the word?
That's a beautiful thought. I mean, vayinafash as in nefesh. So perhaps.
The yinafash I get, but the Shavat part, what is that?
Oh, perhaps modern Hebrew can help us or complicate it. In modern Hebrew, shvita or lishbot means to
strike. Right.
You don't want to strike. So that always
Stop.
Yeah, I guess I don't have a sermon here to give you. I'm just throwing this out. Like, it has something to do with totally stopping everything.
Okay.
Which may or may not be a rest, right? Like, not necessarily rest.
That's nice.
You
Yeah.
know, which is interesting. Yeah.
Right.
It's an interesting question of, I think, a lot of, what the folks said, like Kohler and Rosenberg, was stopping is not, and watching, right? Is, you could say you rest as in you stop. Like the English word to rest doesn't necessarily mean to rejuvenate. It means, okay, now rest, meaning like a rest in a music, right? Which is stop. And then a pause rather than, rejuvenation and recovery and so on. So there's some ambiguity in the English word there too, as well. Yes, I'm sorry, I hadn't even thought. I was doing the
I'm just teasing.
making a way of thinking about 7, because the more I looked at all the examples of 7, the more I was exhausted, like, oh my God, kind of tiring, in the biblical. Yes, Sherry, last for you.
So, no, just very quickly, I missed the beginning of your class, but have you got, are the handouts on a shareable, on a link somewhere? So
We can send them to Rachel. Thank you so much, Rachel. We'll be happy to do it because the whole thing started with the Pirkei Avot.
yeah, I'm especially interested in the poem as well.
Oh, absolutely. Happy to send it to you. And I'll be happy to send you the whole book if you like. All right, guys, this is very sad. We miss you so much. We love hanging out with you and so appreciate this wonderful time on Rosh Hashanah.
Great.
Shares
Thank you.
See you.
Yeah.
Shana
Shana Tova, everybody.
Shana Tova.
Wonderful
Sandy
to
and
see
Sheva.
you. Wonderful.
Wonderful to see
Wonderful
you.
to see Sandy and
Big
Sheva.
hug.